All right, let me then finish with this. So we started by saying, video games look essentially trivial. What they are is simply offering people a grammar by which they can create meanings. And then we saw that they gradually get deeper and deeper as they allow you to create deeper and deeper meanings, right up through having a history, a developmental career, or a practice. And that essentially, when doing that, they give you the story of your own learning. All right? Now, why lots of people are interested. So, and I've also suggested that the commercial industry does this very well. It holds out tremendous potential to do this sort of thing in ways in which, for example, in a game like Morrowind's, people are learning deep moral issues about choices in life. In a game like Full Spectrum Warrior, they're not learning to be a war maker, they're learning to be a peacemaker. In a game like Rise of Nations and Civilization, they're building histories that really suggest alternatives to what history could have been. I'll give you an example of that. My colleague Kurt Squire uses the game Civilization, where you build a whole history. So now what you share with everything you play with is a whole capacity to create a civilization and build it over time, and you by the end of the game, are a world builder. You've built a whole world. These are called God games for a reason, because now when you're sitting around the fire and we're sharing stories of how I built my civilizations, it's two gods talking. We built whole worlds. So Kurt was teaching middle school kids, all of them kind of at risk for school failure, to play this game and then eventually to mod it, right? To be able to modify the game and build new civilizations into it that aren't even in the game. And the first time he did it for his thesis, he was doing it in Chicago, and the kids doing it with him were all African-American kids. And they all chose to play the game as Native Americans. They wanted to be Indians. And so they started in the game, with the nothing civilizations, Native Americans, and, in the game you have to put your civilization in a certain place, and depending on its geography and what minerals are there, it gives opportunities or not, and you learn that there are better and worse places for civilizations to start geographically, and there are better and worse choices for them to make. And the kids who didn't much like history, which, by the way, is the least popular subject in American schools, well, partly because it's a tissue of lies, the kids realized all of a sudden, as they got very invested in these Native Americans, right? Because remember, who's playing the game isn't them or the Native Americans. It's the melding of them. Their bodies have gone out to the Native Americans. It's them in the game. They're sharing knowledge with these Native Americans who know how to build up their culture, but you have to make the right choices. The kids, it dawns them all of a sudden, wow, these guys are going to get conquered by the Spanish. They knew that much history. They said, this is going to be screwed. My Indians are going to get killed. So they went and got their history textbook, probably the first time they ever picked it up, to find out when that would happen. They were using it as a cheat sheet. And they went back into the game and were sure that their Native Americans were ready for the Spanish by the time that happened, and not one of them got colonized. Right? Now, you see, the thing about that is a profoundly deep view of history, because it says that what it is to understand history is not to understand what happened, but what could have happened, and what we could do differently. And so those kids, because they had a career of not being an historian, but being God, understood it didn't have to happen that way. And then they understood why it did happen that way, and how we might be able to avoid it. And again, playing that type of game would have been good for planning in places like Iraq. So now, why then would we want... We've seen that now the tools exist for kids to modify games. So, by the way, his current group doing Civilization, African-American kids, chose to mod the game by putting Icelandic civilization into it, Vikings. And they built the whole civilization. They had to go research all the Vikings, start them off at the beginning, and get them going through all of time. Very typical, by the way. They could have chosen Africans. Most multicultural people would say they would choose Africans, but they chose Vikings. I mean, I myself wouldn't mind being a Viking. And they modded the whole game and made a whole civilization that they didn't know anything about. They chose it because they thought it would be cool, but didn't know anything about it, so they went and learned all about it so they could modify the thing and put Vikings in there and think about how Viking civilization interacted with all these other civilizations. So kids can modify games, and there's a lot of people, we're one of them, but other people are doing this, are building software for kids to design their own games. Why would that be a good idea? Because I've already said that playing the game is a form, if you're reflective, is already a form of producing a history, producing a story, producing a trajectory. And you can, if you're getting kids to be reflective about that, it's already a form of equipment for living that is producing and not just consuming. And think about it. If kids actually go as far as to build the games themselves, they have to think of, what is it like for me to build a story that you can make? What is it like for me to build problems that you'll learn to solve? And then the kid has to become a theoretician of other people's learning. Right? What a game designer has to think about is, how can I get a set of problems that you will learn and have deep pleasure learning, but I will not have constrained or controlled how you did it in such that you feel that you did it and I didn't do it. That's what a game designer has to think. What a great thing for a kid to think, to become a designer of other people's learning, or a designer of empowering other people to construct their own stories, their own histories and careers. Because then you have to think, like these kids did with the Vikings, what would be an interesting career to give somebody else? Right? What are an interesting set of moral choices for people to make so that at the end of the day they have an interesting story to tell? This would be a form of meta-knowledge with a tremendous purchase of ways to think about the world. It may someday be, a new form of literature in which kids are already writing by playing the game, but by modifying and making the games, they're making this equipment for people to live together, to do things like making peace rather than making war, if we make these games on a broader amount of material than killing each other. Okay, so that's what I have to say about video games in terms of some of their potential. If you talk about with that potential, how many of those games have been made that realize that potential? 1% of them. Right? We have barely touched the potential to give people trajectories, stories, careers, and lives, to do performance before competence, and to be able to sit by the fire with each other, juxtaposing those stories. Most of that creativity and innovation is going to come from programs that are not in the commercial industry.